And this is the part 2/3 of our portfolio extravaganza. And there'll also be a continuation of the InDesign piece in January. I'm looking at Forrest. I think the date's going to be released, right, to do a second follow-up tutorial if anybody missed the first one or wants to do it again. But I'm really here to say I'm really thrilled to have Michael Bierut here of Pentagram. And just a couple things in case you don't know who he is. He's a partner at Pentagram, graphic design, who works on most big pieces of architecture you've seen, I'm sure, and public pieces of architecture and public sites in the city. Prior to that, he was 10 years with Vignelli Associates, Massimo Vignelli, where he was the president of graphic design. And just a couple things I wanted to mention that might be interesting to you. And one is that he did the graphics for the New York Times building, which is pretty cool. He also did this public promotion for the Philip Johnson Glass House, so it's kind of big thing, small thing. And the redesign of the magazine, I love this, The Atlantic. Now, he is a senior critic in graphic design at the Yale School of Art, and there's a couple of books that you might be interested in. He's going to show us some also, but one is the co-editor of the anthology series, Looking Closer, Critical Writings of Graphic Design. Also a monograph on Tibor Kalman called Perverse Optimist. And he's the co-author of the weblog, which is I think it's a really interesting site, actually. And I'm going to make a plug for it. So if anybody who's interested in kind of what's going on in design, the weblog is called Design Observer. And he has commentaries about graphic design in everyday life, and they can be heard nationally for the Public Radio International program. So he's on public radio. So sometimes you're like going somewhere and you tune on public radio, and you might be hearing Michael Bierut's voice. So for all of these reasons and many more, I welcome Michael, and thank you.
You guys can hear me okay? Lori, thank you. Leslie, thank you for inviting me. You guys, this is, drama, so you take all the drama I can get. You guys are actually fairly experienced, I understand, in some of these graphic design matters. I've been giving these little talks to architects probably over the last 15 years or so. And when I started, I was kind of this missionary from this distant land, peddling a fairly arcane and not particularly appealing religion, graphic design. It was all about fonts and layout and things like that. And it was like really esoteric, because most people, to the degree they were interested, they found it difficult to do, and most people would opt to just leave it to the professionals. But that was, when I started doing this, that was before the days of what we called at the outset desktop publishing. And that revolution really took all the means of production, to take a Marxist phrase, and returned it to the hands of the people. So whereas in 1980s, say, a long time ago, 30 years ago, if you wanted some typesetting done, you had no recourse but to go to a place that specialized in doing that had made a huge capital investment in the machinery that actually set type, and all the fonts that, if you bought a font, you were actually buying something that would be delivered to a loading dock in wooden crates back in those days. If you wanted to set, a line of Helvetica, that actually would take some real doing. And when I was in college, of course, we had rub-down lettering, press type, or dry transfer lettering, or letraset, called various things. And that was sort of a type for the uninitiated who could afford to do it by hand with a little stylus, and as long as they had enough letters to go around, they could typeset whatever they wanted, one letter at a time. But come the mid-'80s, with the introduction of the personal computer and desktop publishing, suddenly all these things were more in the hands of not just licensed professionals, but anyone who had a computer. And nowadays, of course, you're constantly being invited every time you do a Microsoft Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, never mind. InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator, the different sorts of programs that you guys have become familiar with. You're invited to select a typeface and make a lot of complex graphic design decisions that used to be just the purview of people who were trained specifically to do just that. In trying to think of it, so you guys are much more informed than your predecessors would have been when I would have been giving a little address like this in an architecture school, 15, 20 more years ago. The thing I'm going to talk about today is books. And I think you've already talked a little bit about books. The book is object, how to organize things. And the books that we're talking about today are ones that I've worked on in my studio, mostly having to do with design and architecture and things like that. I happened to, the summer before this one just passed, I moved from a big house to a much smaller house. Combination of the pressures of the recession and the imminent departure of the last kid from our house. We no longer needed the bedrooms and instead needed some money and decided to move. But one of the unfortunate byproducts of the move was that I went from having a single room that had 1 million built-in bookcases to a tiny little room that had some bookcases that were from, I don't know, Crate and Barrel or Pottery Barn or something, right? So I had to go on a diet. I ended up taking about, I think, 40 or so boxes of, I had 60 boxes of books. I managed to keep 20 of them. I donated 20 of them to a local library up in Tarrytown, New York, and I put 20 of them in storage against the day where I might have some other house that has built-in bookcases. But in a really depressing feat of planning ahead, I did this really horrible, depressing thing where all of the books that had to do with film and theater, I put my son Andrew's name on because he's studying film right now in college. All the books that had to do with history, I put my daughter's name on, and so my son came in and said, "Why are my name on these boxes?" And I said, "Oh, there may be some time, not tomorrow, not soon, hopefully. There may be some time where you and your sisters are going to have to go out to some rented warehouse and sort of look at these books, look at these boxes and say, what's in these boxes? Oh, this one has my name on it. So you can, one way or another, this is your inheritance." So that also got me thinking not just about death, but also about why we buy books, why we need to have books. And I sort of am culpable in many ways because I've actually devoted a good part of my career to designing these books. And some of the books, indeed, I was putting in storage. Heavy, cumbersome, bulky, hard to lift books in big, heavy, cumbersome, hard to lift boxes. I had a hand in actually, causing to come into the world. And I found myself questioning as I was lifting box number 23, 24, 25, why the hell I had bothered just creating all this bulk. And so there must be some reasons for it. So I thought I'd kind of review, why we make books, why we buy books, why books sort of matter. So, what are they for? They're obviously, you can read, I was reading a book on the subway up here, a real book that was printed on paper, but around me were other people reading books on devices like Kindles and iPads. So, you can have a book to pass the time. Paper books still have a kind of utility, I suspect, that will take a while to supplant. There's just something kind of handy about them. But they're also used as an aid to grace and posture. We don't even know what that book is or why I was selected to kind of teach this lady how to stand up perfectly straight and walk in a poised way. You can use them to make yourself more of a big shot. And then, of course, you can just amass them. And then once you've amassed them, of course, if it's a private library, as this one is, you can decide that you want to organize them by the color of their spines. That's one way to do it. This, on the other hand, is a public school library. It's actually one that I had a hand in the design of, designed by the architect Richard Lewis for the Robin Hood Foundation, part of their library initiative. But the most interesting part of it is the decorations around the uppermost part of the library that were done by the children's book illustrator and general illustrator Myra Coleman, Tibor Coleman's wife, in fact. She was invited to kind of decorate that space and just kind of created this curated collection of enigmatic objects that have some hidden meaning, or so she claims, but no one has ever come close to fathoming what that meaning is as of yet. But it'll be there for a while, so we have time to work on it. But books can do different things, really. Books can be an archive. And now I'm going to show you a series of books, covers, and a couple of spreads that we've worked on, talk a little bit about how we conceived each of them, what the intention was with each of them, and really how they differ one from the next. I think those differences might be perhaps the most telling part of it for you guys as you're thinking about how to tell your own stories as architects, and how to present, what could be complicated, arcane work to a barely interested and perhaps actually dismissive world, as it often is. Sorry, I didn't mean to be continue to be depressing. I apologize. There will be people who are interested, and I promise they're out there. And the trick is, how do you actually take material and put it in a form that it announces itself as being interesting to the people who are most likely to be engaged by it. So some books sort of function as an archive. Sometimes the archive's primarily of writing. This is a book that you may have seen. It's a compilation of the critic Paul Goldberger's writings for The New Yorker, where he writes the Skyline column that appears, I think, about once a month or so. And so when you design a book, a commercial book at least, you have several clients. Your direct client is not, in this case, Paul Goldberger, who I think was shown things, but didn't have we got very little direct instruction from him. Instead, we were really working for the publisher, in this case is Monticelli Press, which is an imprint of Random House. So their interest is, how do you kind of like give this book, 1, a title, and then 2, a cover design, and 3, an interior layout that will appeal to someone in a book. Well, appeal first to a buyer for, say, Barnes and Noble, or Borders, or a big bookstore chain. Perhaps look good in a small thumbnail on an Amazon page, and signal to people what kind of book it is. So books of architectural criticism seldom show up on any bestseller list, except the one that they used to have at Urban Center Books, I guess. But Goldberger's writing, as you know, is engaging. It's for a general audience. And I think the trick here was to take a lot of repurposed articles and kind of cast them in a way that would make the most of their current relevance. And so we could have had a much more bookish treatment of the title, but instead we opted for one that was set in very bold sans serif typography. It's the typeface called BAU, like the first 3 letters in Bauhaus. The inverted skyscrapers in the top, that's the skyline of Chicago, was selected. A lot of debate about whether there should be any buildings on the front of this. The feeling from the publisher was that putting buildings on the front would clue people into the fact that this book was about architecture, but then there was a lot of kind of soul searching about what buildings one would show, because it seemed to preclude or be too specific and preclude the kind of broad range of material that Goldberger was writing about. So the question was what to put in the front. Inverting that image seemed to kind of render it abstract enough and played a little bit into the up and down in the title. And then the pages on the inside, I think, belie slightly their magazine roots by having very pronounced headlines, more pronounced than they would be in a more academic book, I would say, or a more conventional book. And illustrations, the ones that appeared, I believe, in the original print edition of The New Yorker. And then we had a little conceit where we simply took the beginning of each essay and set it in a bigger type size. And that happened to do with a discovery we made that Goldberger tended to write, as magazine journalists do, I think, tended to write kind of grabby beginnings because they're competing for people's attention. In The New Yorker, that's with short stories, other kinds of reporting, cartoons, ads for various luxury goods. So Goldberger had to sort of like start these things with a little bit of a bang. And so we made the most of it by making all those introductions a little bit bigger. Oddly enough, I said this belied its magazine roots, but in fact, if you guys know The New Yorker, in fact, is very, very understated in its layout. very unchanging in the way it's presented, its typography and its stories. And this, in a way, is much more aggressive than the New Yorker would ever dare, with the heavy sans serif headline and that big thing that you'd call a deck, I believe, in journalistic terms. And so it's a different sort of treatment than it had in its original life. And indeed, I found in reading the book, both as we were reading it in galleys after it was set, these essays actually read differently to me than they did in the original New Yorker pieces, where they seem much more disposable and much more kind of you could come at them in a much more cursory sort of way. I think putting something in a book makes a bigger claim on your attention. Likewise, that convention that we just sort of set on, the picture would come down from the top. The picture would define, so whether if it was a tall picture like this one or a short picture like that one, it would sort of define in the end how much room would be allotted underneath for that little introductory bit here that's only 4 lines here and it's more lines there, right? That's one kind of archive book. This is another one. This was a Robert Stern repurposing some older essays from 1964 to 1988. And this is published by Yale Press, and it's much more, I'd say, formal in the way that it's set up. So very simple layouts, doesn't have the, doesn't use the devices of a magazine layout as the Goldberger book does. This is about as conventional a book as I think you'll see here, but I think part of the thing was to just sort of make this thing feel like a repository of some slightly dated, but kind of, I think all the more interesting because of their antique quality in some cases, if you can call 1978 sufficient provenance for an antique. They're more interesting. It might be more interesting to read today than they were even at the time, through the lens of the successive years. Again, most of the books we work on have pictures in them, and figuring out the balance between pictures and text is a real challenge. You guys will be told, or perhaps even believe, that quote-unquote people don't read anymore, and yet people do read if you give them something interesting. The trick is how much confidence you have in the material that you're putting in front of them, how much writing is enough writing, how much writing is too much writing. I find a lot of times, particularly when I'm working on more pure architectural monographs, and particularly the more straightforward ones, that there's this sort of like grinding quality to the descriptions of the work that's shown, where you can just kind of tell, okay, I only have 11 more to go after I write this one. Now I only have 10 more to go. Is this someone doing like, horrible kind of weight resistance calisthenics to no end, getting sweaty as they're kind of plowing through these project descriptions? For this project, where the site was slopey and the person wanted a place to put their horse, just kind of, I don't know, then it just goes on and on. I don't know. So it's sort of tough. This is different, though, because all these pictures are just marginalia that are illustrating points that are raised in the main essays, right? This is a brand new book that we've done with Tony Vidler as the author. It's a joint publication between Yale and the Canadian Center for Architecture, and it's about, literally an archive, it's about James Sterling's archive, which is held up in, at the Canadian Center. Again, this is a really, I would say, fairly esoteric book, but an important one because it's really exposing a whole wealth of material from the archive of an architect that is much less known than a lot of other ones who are, much less known and more influential, I would say, than a lot of other ones of his generation, a lot of other ones with whom he will share space on bookcases and in bookstores. This is literally an archive. It's a bunch of boxes that he had amassed over the course of his career. Sterling was like a lot of architects, a real inveterate saver of early sketches, presentations, working drawings, presentation drawings, and all of these are basically in the archive and kind of gone through very carefully by Tony and his staff. The cover actually shows a model in a box, fragile, keep lid on. It's just to kind of like cue that it's that. And I think what we tried to do is interrupt these fairly quiet pieces. There's a lot of very light sketches, a lot of pieces that are really ephemeral, with a series of kind of very bold divider pages that clearly to the reader are meant to guide you step by step through the various parts of this book. The writing is very multivalent. There's a combination of aphorisms, quotes, interpretive material, long captions for the pieces. And so again, one of the things that one has to do when you're working with a text that has a lot of different sort of internal voices in it is come up with different ways of presenting each of those voices so the reader can kind of know who's talking at any one time. And like I said, it's unlike a lot of the books we do these days, this one was printed really beautifully in Italy. You can really see every single detail in these drawings. I really recommend it to you, not so much for the design, which I think is fairly understated, but very serviceable, but for the material itself, which I think is pretty remarkable. And there's a whole series of great drawings done on the back of like airplane boarding passes and things. As students of architecture, it's really nearly pornographic in its interest, I dare say. So another thing a book can be is a record, just a straightforward record of things. This is a book that Stern did based on a series of tapes he had recorded in interviews with Philip Johnson, obviously before his death, and this is one of my favorite books I've ever worked on because this is the basic raw material consists of two things. There's the transcripts of these tapes, which are very chatty, and Johnson was a real raconteur, as you probably heard, had some sort of codicil connected with this material that it couldn't be published until a certain period of time had passed after his death. He's basically, I don't want to say it's catty outright, but it's like a lot of judgments being passed on all sorts of different people. So the transcript itself was very entertaining to read. However, or maybe one of the reasons it's entertaining to read is that it really feels like gossipy in talk between Johnson, who like knew everything, and a younger Robert A.M. Stern, who at that point didn't quite know everything, but was trying to keep up with Johnson as he kind of followed along in these tapes. Johnson keeps dropping names of things, quick references to things, and so one of the entertaining things that Stern organized was the book itself has a running text, and then we sort of used we footnoted all the references in the text, sometimes with photographs, sometimes just with footnotes, and they kind of ran along. So Johnson would just throw in someone's last name really quickly, and there's a footnote explaining who that person was, and sometimes showing a photograph of that person. So that's he mentions Hugh Stubbins along there on the left-hand page, a little picture of Hugh Stubbins, just identifying him in a time. There's on the right there is Johnson's official transcript from Harvard. It seems to have done okay, not great. He was like an indifferent student, I believe, at Harvard. But it's sort of like, so this book is actually really, I'm really proud of it, partly because it sort of has this, there's the transcript, which is just very colloquial, and then the footnotes, which usually are kind of just, mind-numbingly academic, here kind of are this counterpoint, or kind of almost like like what would be online, a pop-up thing, or they kind of identify each of these obscure references. By the way, as I'm talking, anyone has a question, just raise your hand and we can answer them as we go along, and I'll do questions at the end, of course, as well. This book is a record too, very different project. I mentioned that library initiative that New York's Robin Hood Foundation had started about 10 years ago now, and a few years ago they decided they wanted to sort of document the whole thing, not just as a coffee table book, and indeed this is a small paperback book that I don't think really is coffee table worthy. Instead, this is meant to be a handbook that people could use to go out and kind of like improve their local library as well. So we had done this logo for the project that embedded that exclamation point inside the word library by substituting for the letter I. And the book itself is a combination of things. It kind of goes down and more or less picks out every one of the libraries that were done. There are about 30 to 50 libraries that were either done or in process while this book was being done. It sort of goes through and does like a little taxonomy of the library, explains what the relevant parts were, what the strategy was to bring it to life. This one was done, I think, by Henry Meyerberg when he was working with David Rockwell, and it's basically just a gymnasium, I think, that was repurposed to be a library. But then there's also a lot of work about the process that went into making these things. This is a library by the Brooklyn Navy Yards, I think, where the graphic artist Peter Arkell did these series of black and white illustrations, and you can see the resolution's not fabulous on the screen, but you can sort of see in the upper right there a drawing that he did from a photographic reference shown immediately to the left. And then there was this questionnaire that he used to record kids' reactions to books. So all of this was kind of documented journalistically in the drawings you see on the wall in the illustration on the lower right. And there's a library by Myra Coleman again. So sometimes there's a nice close-up look at one of the libraries as well. So this book is really meant to be something. This is Princeton Architectural Press did this one. We picked Century School Book as the typeface. A lot of times I sort of will pick typefaces just because they have some pleasing, to me, relationship to the subject matter. Sometimes that works out pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't work and I have to change it. But in this case, sort of the quintessential kind of children's storybook typeface seemed to work pretty well as the typeface for this. You can see clearly where it says PS 106 up there. Sometimes books are an occasion to reassess someone's career or body of work. Again, this is a joint publication from the Yale University Press and the Yale School of Architecture, and it's basically started as a symposium on Johnson. And it's mostly just major essays about Johnson and his work combined with images that were probably shown, most likely shown during the actual lectures that were delivered at the symposium. So this is a very kind of straightforward book for reading, oversized, kind of deliberately kind of elegant, and divided up in kind of different sections. And I forget why it was that we kind of hit on that affectation of the period after everything. I don't know, maybe it was meant to sort of like give this whole thing a little bit of a memorial quality, you know, full stop or something, I don't know. And a lot of work was done to find that image, which is Johnson at the dining table in the glass house with this kind of strange reflection. Is it a reflection? You know, what's being reflected? Are we looking in or out, sort of thing, which I think was meant to reinforce the nature of the both of the original symposium and of the material that was amassed for this book. And again, this is a case where it's you know, deliberately choosing kind of very deliberately what kinds of images best represent a project. These are all from Johnson's work at Lincoln Center, from sketches to the interior of the New York State Theater, right? Yeah. This is not yet published, but it's another reassessment. This is this book that Yale's doing on Kevin Roach, which I have to admit was one of the most interesting and surprising books I've done recently. Roach, I think, is an architect that I may be wrong speaking here, but he's not thought of. I don't think he's not regarded, period. You know, either good or bad or even known that much now, but has a really interesting and kind of relevant. It'll be increasingly relevant body of work, I think, going forward. And so it's this is a case where the work is, if you know his work, it kind of reached its zenith in this sort of corporate this kind of corpulent perhaps, corporate opulence sort of. And so we needed, we made choices about the typography that could stand up to these really strong images that are kind of very geometric, sometimes even rather shiny, like this one is, and kind of could really work and kind of feel like it's big and brawny and sort of corporate in its use. If you get a chance, when this book's not yet published, so you're just looking at layouts here, but it's got a couple of fantastic things in it that I got to go through firsthand. One of them that I learned was that Roach is a master presenter. He just can really present architectural ideas with the kind of clarity that I don't think I've ever seen any architect do quite so well. He started in working as one of Eero Saarinen's right-hand guys, and I suspect in that capacity he had to be Saarinen interpreter a lot and kind of explain rationales, or sometimes even invent rationales for ideas that Saarinen would have about why a building should look this way versus that way. So it's hard to tell here, but the thing on the left is a series of slides that he used to present the original proposal to the somewhat suspicious board of the Ford Foundation, and this became the Ford Foundation building that you guys probably know over on West 42nd Street, right? West 43rd Street? 42nd, right? With the big Corten steel interior atrium. This is to a crowd of people who were expecting a dignified building that had views that looked out into fresh air, not into an interior atrium, and not made out of what they ended up making it out of either. And he somehow managed to sell them on this idea, and it's quite remarkable when you sort of see how he built the logic tree that led to it. And a lot of amazing patterns. The thing you see up there on the upper left is the carpet pattern for the Cummins Engine Technical Center in Columbus, Indiana. And you see a little bit of that carpet pattern kind of getting played out below. Kind of amazing mind at work, actually. And so this is actually structured very much with essays, interpretive assessment essays at the beginning that they go into a kind of catalog raisonné in the end part where each project is shown and described in a fairly straightforward way. So there is kind of a record to accompany the reassessment. Sometimes things are outright tributes. I apologize for all this New Haven stuff down here in Morningside Heights. It's what I got, it's the songs that I know, so I'll sing them. They got this building they got up there designed by Paul Rudolph. It just got a fairly elaborate restoration. And on the occasion of it getting reopened, a really interesting little book of Rudolph's writings were published and kind of given out there and still available. That, again, Yale Press and Architecture co-published. And with that, I think this gets down to sort of almost an absolute zero level of decisions for someone for a graphic designer like me to be making, because I think it's basically just writing, and you just want to do a few little things to kind of relate the object of the book, which is a very, very modest little paperback, probably about 6 by 8, let's say. And only, probably 160 or so pages, relatively thin, modest little book. How do you build in make a couple of choices to just relate it in some gentle way to the occasion? And because this was, the occasion was the rededication of the Art and Architecture building that he did up there on the Yale campus, which I assume you can all picture in your mind, kind of an example of cast concrete, cantilevered, robust American Yankee brutalism, with a nice strong sans serif typeface, and inside we kind of did this maneuver that is sort of a cheap trick for a graphic designer, but you see how it kind of goes in and out in those shapes? That's obviously, or at least horribly obvious to me, a reference to kind of the formal language, specifically of that building, and certainly one that Rudolph used elsewhere as well. And sometimes it just kind of is simply functional, as shown here. It's just kind of accommodating slightly wider photographs. But we did things one wouldn't necessarily have to do, like the photographs go in, the text is like a volume, and the photographs go in one level, the captions don't go in quite so far. So it's kind of treated in this sort of plastic sort of way that I think, well, I wouldn't presume to say how much relationship it had to the way Rudolph conceived the spaces in that building, but it's meant to be a little bit of a tribute to it, as I said in that title piece. And a lot of these books, if you go to Rizzoli or places like that, are obviously trophies of one type or another, and trophies for whom is the question. This is a book Monticelli did for Daniel Libeskind. Like I said, obviously in the previous book we had no contact whatsoever with Paul Rudolph, who has been, dead for some time. Daniel and Nina Libeskind were very involved with this book, and there was a lot of going back and forth about how it would be presented, and a lot of going back and forth again about the cover, which is actually the presentation's fairly, it's just a wrapped hardcover book, but it's got a silver cover, and I'm very proud of the fact that what we did is we took this drawing, one of those drawings that he did earlier on in his career, and did this little maneuver that you can sort of make out there where it's called counterpoint, and it's past, the lines kind of sometimes go on top of the letters and sometimes underneath the letters. It was tricky and very hard to do, and I hope has a subtle sort of effect on the ambiguity or the ambiguous reading of the cover material. The material, which is basically, they're not scholarly essays, they're just recorded commentary by Liebeskind on the projects as you go through them. We made a deliberate choice, and this was, the designers volunteered this as an idea, of taking a statement about each project and blowing it up really big and using that in effect as the title page for a section. So this obviously introduces the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and the typeface, which is a very mechanical typeface that I think you guys might recognize, because it's not a graphic design Adobe typeface, it's a CAD typeface. Kind of works in concert with more normal typefaces like Helvetica and I think Garamond that sort of carry the more textual work of it. So there's, as we did with the Rudolph one, there are like the text and the photographs interact a little bit. You can see in the lower right-hand corner there, that narrow column of text kind of like nips in and kind of violates the corner there. And this is happening in a little bit more of a kind of sort of way, more of the way Liebeskind designs, rather than the kind of big, kind of robust, kind of punchy gestures that Rudolph favored. Or so it appears to me. You guys may disagree. You judge for yourself. But you can sort of, I think that little thing that's happening right here, that's like a more Liebeskindy sort of little thing, a little artifact of where the caption is sort of hitting the picture. Then you get that funny little residual shape, And then sometimes just like, these trophy books require moments, cinematic moments of just big, glamorous, full bleed photography that goes left to right, top to bottom. Same publisher, very different book, landscape architect Ken Smith. You guys probably know Ken's work as well, and he has this very kind of, to my mind, sort of funny and deadpan way of working that just is very, disarmingly straightforward. And so the book itself is like disarmingly straightforward. We have this very weird, I think, weird looking to me, hand-drawn, well, all typefaces are hand-drawn sort of, but it's a kind of a redrawn sans serif typeface that was a friend of the designer on this of the designer working with me on this project had done it as a student project and just thought it had this sort of charming awkwardness that kind of suited a lot of the work. That's the upper and lowercase version of it. And you can barely make out, the type is all in color, and the color kind of has this gradual shift from left to right, from blue into green. So it's meant to sort of, everything's meant to just be more engaging, more vivacious, not feel like this is a formal book about landscape architecture a la Olmsted or, traditional 19th century landscape architecture or more studied 20th century landscape, but Ken's kind of, he'll use plastic flowers and hula hoops if that seems to be warranted kind of landscape architecture. The man himself there on the left. And then we also wanted to have, the photo pages just be really blunt and straightforward. Picture on the left, picture on the right. And then there are these kind of books, these kind of like, just like just stately march through portfolios. This is where I think the writing sort of gets kind of tough. And these, in a way, resemble sort of the challenge. You guys putting your portfolio, you have these projects. How do you describe them? How do you present them? How do you order them? How do you group them, right? And so this is sort of about as straightforward as you can get. It says the name of the project in the upper left, describes when it was done and what kind of thing it is. In the adjacent to it, beneath it, is one of those descriptions. And then there's a series of pictures that describes what goes on inside, right? We've done a bunch of these for Mr. Stern, and it's interesting because the ones, which one of these do you think sells the most? Which one? Houses, right? You know why? Because people can buy that and get ideas for things to do in their foyers, right? unless you're actually charged with decorating a college campus, that top one isn't going to be of much, practical use to you. Although I think if you get a chance, the one on top actually is a little bit different from the three below, because it's obviously the premise of it is it's a book of of cataloging the firm's work on college campuses. But each of the sections begins with what I think is a really lovely, intelligent, contextual essay that sort of describes what makes, any one college campus, the specific college campus he's talking about, different, what their traditions are, what their challenges are, and so forth, with a great, just enough kind of historical supplementation that really makes it worth reading. I think all of the books we've done for Stern and with him have been really interesting intellectual challenges. These are kind of the magnum opus, I think, that end up always kind of really testing our mettle as designers. But I think each one of them has some rewards to be found, even if you're not necessarily interested in the picture book quality. I think the writing is always kind of sensitive and well-researched, particularly the top one, which is, I think, the newest of all those. And sometimes books themselves can kind of be biography. Any of you guys know this book? It's really, really interesting. This is one where Yale and Urban Center had done this as a project, actually, where they asked a whole bunch of architects to sort of do two things. One, catalog their own bookcases, and then select 10 books that you name as your favorites. And what's interesting in this, I don't know if you're like me, but if you like books and you're in someone's house or in their apartment and their bookcases there, I find myself always sort of, eventually wandering, if it's a party or something and I'm not being watched carefully, I'll wander off and I'll just sort of like start seeing what books are on their bookcase. And it's sort of interesting, that collection in some way kind of it becomes a little biography of who their owner is. And sometimes I wonder whether people actually buy books or display them, thinking that it'll speak well. I mean, obviously this is something where some people have done this. Having these books will speak well of them. I know a woman who sells, who runs a rare bookstore here in Manhattan, and when I ask her how business is, sometimes, her business rises and falls sometimes depending on whether nouveau riche people are building McMansions that include libraries that require books on their shelves to make them look convincing. And not any books will do. They have to be proper books. And people literally, interior designers or decorators will go to her and say, well, he's interested in, armies and boats and football and then she'll write that down and then kind of and we're looking to spend about X amount, and then I assume later on a truck shows up in the big winding driveway and has a bunch of boxes like the boxes I was packing. Then Mr. Gotrocks then can walk in with pride to his library and kind of sit and kind of read Sports Illustrated or do Sudoku or whatever it is one does in a library these days, and surrounded knowing that all these books reflect his interests, or at least his interest that it was characterized by his interior design consultant to a bookseller he never met. And so books can be biography. This is actually a little bit more down to earth and real than that scenario I just described. And so there's the sort of shows sort of the, this is actually very straightforward and kind of pornographic again, if you want to, or voyeuristic at least, not pornographic. It'll go into a number of different architects, including, say, Peter Eisenman, photograph of his library shown there on the right, and then a little interview with him about, why books are important or what he's interested in or why he bought the books he bought. And then it's actually this very kind of like, you can actually read the titles, step-by-step shots of the bookcases, right? You're going to see what he's got there. Then there's always a part at the end where for each of these library owners, they pick their top 10 books. And this is a challenge really to very crucial statement one senses, how predictable should one be? What are some books one must simply name, or, leaving them off would be just shocking. What ringers can you throw in to show that you're not like all the other people in the book? So you can see that, if you can read it, it's got, Eisman's got Walter Benjamin, and then Corbusier, Jacques Derrida, of course, I suppose. Light in August by William Faulkner. That's a little surprising, I think. Any of you guys recognize the one on the far right just from the cover alone? I forget what that is on the top. Then you got Cool House and Pynchon and Complexity and Contradiction. I believe Complexity and Contradiction was the winner in terms of most named by most people, I think, for some reason. Well, for obvious reasons, perhaps. So this is a cute little book, too. And while we were working on it, they kept saying, oh, this is going to be really a popular book. And it just sort of seemed like this exercise of a thing, but it did turn out to sell really, really well. And it was really fun to work on, and also really fun to look at. It's sort of fun and sort of, you feel a little bit cheap looking at it, because it's not like reading any of these books, but you sort of feel like you're having a highly literary experience just in the hands of all these avatars, right? And finally, books can be legacies as well. This is a book we did on Eero Saarinen's legacy. This book actually and the Kevin Roche book are direct companions with each other. Finding that photograph on the front cover, which shows the final placement, or the first attempted final placement of the keystone on the St. Louis Memorial Arch. You can sort of see underneath, you can't quite make it up, there's like a huge crowd of people gathered underneath for this momentous occasion. And if I recall, because of the expansion that would happen in the joints in the metal, they were trying to do this like first thing in the morning, and it had been cool overnight, and somehow it just didn't work. They had to wait till it got a little bit warmer or something so it would fit. I don't know, there's something like that, or maybe vice versa. At any rate, they tried to jam the first time, it just didn't fit. Had to wait a little bit to make it work. And so this is a case where it's a bunch of critical assessments, a look at some major projects, and then going carefully one at a time through a bunch of smaller, more modest projects as well. Again, in this case, one of our challenges was, with all of these, it's like picking a typeface and kind of picking a format, and materials is always an interesting thing. We picked this typeface called, sometimes called Euro style, sometimes called Microgamma, designed in 1952, I believe, and very sort of, I thought, apropos for the height of Saarinen's powers. Also has those, the words Eero actually look great in it because it has that kind of roundy sort of like thing happening with it, and not unlike some of the forms that he ended up using in some of his buildings as well. And then this is a very recent book, also an archive. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this. This was a book that we had a big hand in putting together. We were approached by Jane Thompson, who just won the Cooper Hewitt Lifetime Achievement Award, married to the architect Ben Thompson, who was with the Architects Collaborative up in Boston and was the mind behind the renovation of Faneuil Hall in Boston, and then Harbor Place in Baltimore, and then the South Street Seaport here in New York, and his progeny probably unhappily includes all sorts of festival marketplaces all over the place. But way back when, in the 60s and 70s, he and Jane ran this store in downtown Cambridge called Design Research, which is arguably the store that kind of introduced the idea of design as retailing, or retailing as design, to America. It was the first store where a lot of design products were available anywhere in North America, and it really was because the Thompsons just had an eye for and enthusiasm for this sort of thing. The store was open probably for less than 10 years, had enormous influence, and then closed. Ben Thompson died. Jane Thompson is well along in years, and I think was really interested in kind of creating an archive of the influence of the store, now gone, so that people could actually see it. So the store is really interesting, and it sort of consists of the book consists of some essays by Jane and others, but the bulk of it is a series of interviews conducted by the writer Alexandra Lang, who just went around and talked to dozens of people, constructing sort of an oral history of the store, people who worked there, people who knew of it, people who shopped there, and then cobble these things together into sort of a running narrative, sort of a la the book Edie by George Plimpton about Edie Sedgwick, where he had done all the, I don't know if you know that book, but Plimpton was writing this book about, Warhol and 60s superstar Edie Sedgwick, and in order to assemble it, he went and did all these interviews, and then decided with his co-author Gene Stein, instead of taking the interviews and turning them into a book by putting quote marks around things, and he said, she said, he just kind of would say, this person said that, and then that was the quote, just kind of like lined up all the direct quotes one after another. So basically, this book works that way. So those voices you barely see there are like that. But there's also a kind of like a roster of the products that were shown in the store, some of which, as I said, for the first time. And then finally, this is actually the last thing, a book can be sort of an argument in favor of something. And I think the classic one of those was this one that you all know, which was still being argued, as recently as a year or so ago, a big symposium they had up at Yale, sort of not so much about the Venturis, but about actually the influence of that particular book on the profession. We were asked to design the catalog for the current show that's at the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum called Why Design Now, which is their design triennial. So we were doing the catalog of it, and it was conceived as an argument. This is my notes from the original meeting we had with the curators, where they were really talking about a survey of work done in categories that were all meant to be, statements of issues facing the world at large: energy, mobility, health, prosperity, community, et cetera, et cetera. Our challenge was, how do you turn this into a book? So with your permission, if you want, I'm just going to take you really slow. No, I don't I'm going to take you really slowly. I'll take you really quickly through the process of what actually goes into doing a book today. So the book's called Why Design Now. That's the name of the exhibition. From the foreword, it says, we ask questions throughout the exhibition and within this catalog to engage the viewer and the reader. Why and how is design thinking an essential tool for solving some of today's most urgent problems? Why should business leaders, policymakers, consumers, and citizens embrace design values? How can design promote environmental stewardship, social equity, accessibility, and creative capital? So this book is meant to actually serve as a bit of a provocation about these issues through the medium of a bunch of examples of pieces that are answering these questions in different ways. So the National Design Triennial and its 364 selected projects answer these questions with an intention of provoking further discussion. And so it's supposed to be enduring, provocative, useful, responsible, and entertaining as a book. That last thing is easy to forget, but everything you do is competing with for someone's attention against other things, against their desire to play Xbox, their need to change their kid's diaper, their need to go pee, their desire to go to the movies, and you're kind of saying, well, I have something that might be worth your time, and even if you're sure it is, you somehow have to make it easy for them to sort of come to agree with you and devote a little bit of their time to finding out what it is you're trying to tell them. And so all of those things begin with an essay consisting of 389 words, shown here, a series of essays actually. 370 images went in the book. So these are the raw materials we start with. You guys start with, a site and a program and a budget, presumably. We start with a budget and a bunch of words and a bunch of pictures. And there are 384 projects organized in those 8 sections by theme. They more or less state exactly as they were stated in the original meeting we had with the curatorial team. They already had commissioned someone, not us, to design a graphic identity for the exhibition using a specific typeface. And so I'm not a real not invented here sort of person. I like it when someone prompts me with something and says, by the way, you have to use this. Sometimes it's some hideous thing and you have to work your way around it. This I thought was perfectly serviceable. And so we stuck with that as a starting point. Also, because of all these vaunted claims that the curators were making about social responsibility, environmentalism, sustainability, et cetera, it seemed, if we're bothering kind of like making a book and, and introducing to the world, it had to be done in the most environmentally sensitive way possible. Hence, forest service product. Those are certified paper that they have to do with the forestry was sustainable that rendered the paper. Soy-based ink, which is biodegradable. Biodegradable shrink wrap, what it came in. Carbon credits that were traded to make the production carbon neutral, and then a concise, purposeful design. But we didn't want it to be a coffee table book. We wanted it to be a reference book, a guide, a handbook, and a manual, but still entertaining, you know? So the typeface we inherited was this thing called Griffith Gothic, which is a very functional typeface. It has functional roots. It was designed by this guy named C.W. Griffith in the 30s for Bell Telephone. It was the typeface that every telephone book you've ever seen was set in, or a offspring of that typeface. If any of you guys have actually seen a telephone book, which may not be true. The telephone book was what the kid was sitting on playing the piano. If you've never seen one before the internet, you'd look up phone numbers in these books, paper books. Beneath it is a brand new typeface called Chronicle by Tobias Frere Jones and Jonathan Heffler. That's very much a reading typeface. So we combined those two. Then we decided, in order to add some entertainment value, to introduce some color to these things. And the colors we liked were these colors of these really bright highlighting markers for reasons you'll see in a second. What we did was to sort of parse this thing a little more clearly. Take each of those 8 sections and assign each of them one of those bright magic marker colors, right? So the 8-section thing, which was sort of the organizing rationale behind the whole book, became something we really wanted to spotlight. And so then we thought what we could do then is have a book that kind of had a fairly boring, straightforward cover, but if we kind of use those 8 colors kind of in an amusing way, we get this tasty sort of Necco wafer kind of effect, and we looked at the book sideways, and that's shown there on the left. So the basic idea of the book was we actually use those highlighty colors to highlight things, just like this. And so this is a mock-up we did early on showing what we intended to do. We intended to kind of like pick out the key thoughts from the book, highlight them in the color that those thoughts were associated with, whether they were one of those 8 sections. And then when we came to the parts where the themes were illustrated with work from the exhibition, those pages were flooded in the colors that were associated with their respective sections as well. And so this actually solved a number of problems. When you're doing this sort of thing, you guys won't have this problem in assembling your own portfolios, but in this case, 134 different projects, none of which were specially photographed by us for the book. It was always sort of like, please send us a picture of that project. Then something would come in. It could be on a white background, a black background, in situ, in black and white, a drawing, a model, you know, a good photograph, and also a good photograph. And when you're faced with that situation, you need to kind of lay down a really nice, solid, these things are all on the highway, you put a nice net underneath them so none of them actually fall off and kill themselves. And so these color things became sort of the strong net that kind of held up all these 134 different ways of interpreting things, right? And so in doing the book, we created a bunch of sample pages that we used to test out the idea and to obtain kind of a go-ahead from the curatorial team and the publication staff at the Cooper Hewitt. These are shown here. The layout of any of these things is done almost as you would storyboard a movie or anything else. This is most of the book shown from top to bottom, and I think in this form you get to very clearly see the relationship between those color thematic versions and how they progress through page after page of the book. Once we committed to that, we got caught up in this fairly harrowing process of testing those colors because the Cooper Hewitt couldn't afford, and we wouldn't ask them to afford, the luxury of printing each of those colors as a custom color going through the press just by itself to receive ink that had been specially mixed to be that color. Most 4-color things you see, as you probably know, were actually compiled from 4 basic inks, black, magenta, yellow, and cyan. And so it was with these colors too. We had these magic marker colors that we liked, and we had to figure out CMYK values that would simulate them closely. And even once we did that, seeing what would happen when they hit different kinds of paper was always a challenge, right? And then there's, shown here, working out the minute calculations that it took to match those precisely there. Getting color proofs as well of the images that would appear, again, made a little bit challenging because of the various sources that of the images. We worked really hard on the cover, and we went back and forth with the printer quite a bit. You can sort of see that thing on the left there that we ended up calling the BP version, because it sort of looks like a massive, virulent, toxic oil spill kind of like resting on top of the book. Actually kind of a cool anti-design approach, I suppose, but it was so repellent as a physical object that we just couldn't bear to propagate it, I guess. And the thing you see on the right is closer to what we ended up doing. It's just a piece of blackboard with Y design now punched into it. And so the book itself actually looks like this. Again, sort of entertainment value in trying to make it engaging by showing images nice and big on occasion. It's that thing in that drug town down Medellin, right? It's that architect that's doing all those fantastic projects in Medellin. That's around there. And then the idea of the highlighting introduced early on in the table of contents, and you can sort of see it anticipates what you'll encounter later on as those colors peek out at you from the side. And then it just plays its way through all the way like that. So you'll recognize some of these illustrations, I'm sure. Obviously, projected here, some of these colors go a little bit haywire, but we worked back and forth to make sure that they were all kind of balanced and didn't impede the reading of the text too much. And then in the back, there's simply, because the book was sold in that biodegradable shrink wrapped, and publishers were always concerned that people wouldn't be able to fathom what was in this book without, because it has no pictures. We sort of just printed with the hopes that people would read it on the back, this little précis of the book's contents. So that's it. That's everything I've got to show you about books. I didn't use anywhere near the 2 hours I was told I had to go on. That leaves us little time for questions if any of you have any, so I'd be happy to take them if you've got them. It's a horrible day outside, so you're going to stay here and ask a lot of questions. Yes, please.
I've never met an architect who didn't think he or she was also graphic design.
That's correct.
And I just wondered what those conversations were like, if you disagree with that mission or carefully agree with it. How do you find that from there?
Architects are only one. I mean, we all have clients, and they come in different varieties. I like architects a lot, and I like talking with architects a lot. So and also I have to admit, I'm very when it comes to doing these books, I go in with projecting. Well, I was going to say I go in with a great deal of humility, but I actually probably go in affecting a great deal of humility rather than actually being humble. I'm sort of about as humble as any other designer is, I suppose. But I think a lot of it is that I don't have any ideas of my own for these books, basically. I don't I don't go in. None of these books look that way because I always wanted to do a book that looked like that. They really do truly come out of the content. In some cases, when it's a monograph, the content really is the personality of the architect. In some cases, those personalities are very out of scale. I learned early on because when I worked for Massimo Vignelli, the offices were at 475 10th Avenue, same building as Richard Meyer and Gwathmey Siegel. And I sort of remember being on, as a young designer, being on an elevator with Richard Meyer, thinking, he's like the same. He's like an adult man, just like my dad in Ohio, except he doesn't really seem. I don't think I can't even picture them together. They seem to be different species of people. And part of that reason is I think, when I started seeing architects in action, collaborating with them, doing signage projects, let's say, I just kind of learned that the successful ones, among all the other things they have to master, somehow have to be able to stand in a room and convince a lot of confused, fearful, strong-minded, maybe not so smart people to invest a stupendous amount of money on some project just simply based on some little model on a table or some renderings on boards, And that does take a lot of personality. So and then even the ones that aren't famous sometimes are studying to be famous, and so they act like that too. And then sometimes the other ones act like that just because they read The Fountainhead. And so they end up all kind of being handfuls to deal with in one way or another. But usually when I go and I listen carefully, and generally architects have made for me fairly good clients. Their critiques of stuff that I've done, sometimes they get very, the danger is that they'll get very prescriptive, This will work if you do exactly that. And what you don't want is them reaching for the medicine cabinet. You just want them to tell you what hurts, and then you will figure out what pill is the best remedy for that, right? So, but that's true with architects. It's true with anything else. I mean, I kind of learned my place early on and kind of act properly respectful, and then I go off and I do my work. I think at this stage of the game fairly fairly well. So signage projects are much more complicated than the books, because the books actually do seem to be about pure graphic design. When I've done signage projects, a lot of times, the starting point is that every architect thinks that the building itself is the sign and doesn't require any sign on it. They also tend to overestimate the logic of the plan and will assume that no one needs any direction to find anything in the building, including the bathrooms or anything else. And of course, the operators of the building, if it's a public building, generally find out that there is a need, sometimes legal or by code for signs, and sometimes just because human beings have to go and they need to know where the bathroom is, and it's not necessarily as obvious as you'd think. So there's sometimes there's more tension in doing that, but a lot of times I use the same technique where I sort of will rely on the architecture to cue me about not just the plan or the program, but actually the physical elements of the architecture, the hardware, the way the details are resolved will tip me off and give us a lot of guidance in terms of how the signage might look, feel, and behave. It's a good question. Yeah, right there? Well, the question is how's the the digital revolution changed the presentation of this kind of work? And I believe you mean not only how a book's changed, which I think I talked about a little bit at the beginning, but now we have all these alternate ways of accessing this kind of work, which, as as you've probably read, has actually is profoundly threatening the viability of publishing overall, not just publishing of fancy monographs for the shelves of Rizzoli, but making it really hard for anyone to publish anything with so much work available online, so much information available online. Google and Amazon kind of going back and forth with authors about how much work could be available online and essentially free. So that's all of that has to do with like rights and things like that. The more technical question, which is how is in what ways is work, how is it different to view work in these different platforms? I think would be another way to think about it. And I think in the early days of website design, the tendency would be to conceive a website as some sort of on-screen analog to a printed brochure. That's where we get that term brochureware, right? And I'm surprised actually. There are a lot. I have some architects as clients where I've done website or online digital work for them, and that sort of tends a little bit of that tends to hold true, very much so with architects more than with other sorts of clients. I think partly I think because they tend to have this very sort of organized way. Self-conscious, and not self-conscious in a bad way, but kind of they're very conscious of the way the work is presented. And the sequence by which you sort of see projects, the way they're organized, the categories they fall in, the information you learn about the projects, is also, that in a way has all been kind of well organized in a mature studio's archive, going back millions of competitions and pitches and answers to requests for proposal. You've got project sheets, you have capability statements, and a lot of times websites almost always are viewed as first and foremost business development tools for professional service firms, whether they're architects, lawyers, or doctors, or anyone else. And so, and the big terror for particularly an architect is that some not particularly smart or maybe impatient facilities manager who has been told to find some architects who design laboratory buildings for college campuses, will come to your site and not discover that one laboratory building you designed for that one college campus fast enough, And so they'll come, they'll see your site. It looks like you just designed nothing but, summer houses and, or I don't know, something else, and they sort of will strike you off the list, right? So I think every architect sort of just wants to make sure that they're present and accounted for when these phantom notional, never, this fictional, facilities manager at Gott Rocks University is going to be looking for, that one big commission to award, right? So it's really tough. I find it, in fact, I find that much harder than designing the books or even the signage, just because there's this like, we don't know who the audience is. We don't know what they're looking for. But anyone can do it. You sort of can't interview them before they go on your site to figure out what they're there for. And then that sort of leads to this kind of exaggerated idea about what a website is supposed to do for people, really, I think all it's supposed to do is pique someone's interest enough that they actually send an email or pick up the phone and call you. But I think there's this theory that, unless you can provide exhaustive information that satisfies every possible question, you're going to get bumped off the list. And of course, we have no way of knowing which attitude is true because there's so many people out there, and even user surveys don't tend to surface the truth, or the results are so maddeningly ambiguous that it's actually frustrating. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer has to do with purely technical things like, we've designed, at its height, we designed some really great websites, or websites that I think are really cool that are based entirely in Flash. All of those websites don't work on iPads now because of the decision that they made at Apple not to accommodate Flash as a software platform on iPad. And they're powerful enough with that device to actually effectively change the game for everyone else. And so that ends up being kind of a bit of a frustration. And even when it's not quite as deliberately frustrating as that, just the change in scale you get between a big monitor and a iPhone is actually a really critical thing now. And people do expect sort of the same information set to render appropriately on a big monitor and on a handheld device like a phone. And it just means we have to be ever more nimble in terms of how we do these things. It also puts more pressure on, I think, you guys as architects to, this gets sort of philosophical, but I think in a way it may end up putting more pressure on coming up with, of figuring out ways to present your work so that no matter what it is, the image that represents a project is just so kind of strong and simple and telegraphic that it will look good in a big monograph that big, and it will also kind of be legible on an iPhone that big. I think that's fairly reductive and kind of chilling when you think about it that way, but I think that may be part of the name of the game going forward. Oh, yeah, sorry. Right. 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 Yeah, so the question is sort of the nature of exploring something digitally, which is not sequential as a book is, and kind of plays this interesting game between two-dimensional representation and other dimensions, which could be time or could be space. What does that imply? And I think it's interesting because I think that answer is changing all the time, and even now I'd say that. Where, like at this moment, I think what people are sort of getting very attracted to are sites that tend to function almost as databases in a way, where there's almost no design at all, where somehow the data itself is the malleable thing, and if you've done 100 projects and they're each tagged 5 different ways, and you can kind of like sort them by date, or sort them by user type, or sort them by genre, or sort them by this, and they reconfigure in all these different ways. That's something that you can only do digitally. That it's really cumbersome to do with the book unless you sort of have tabs and indices and stuff like that. And that's like one of the elements that I think is attractive to people. I've got 2 really talented partners in New York that have spent their whole lives doing this stuff, and they seem most interested in that right now, and less interested in actually kind of treating the flat screen as as a space that implies depth. That sort of seems like something that everyone is interested in a little bit before. Not the greatest answer, but everyone would have a different one. You had a question there, right?
Yeah, with the exception of the Sterling book, pretty much all the architecture books that you
Right.
photos and renderings to three-dimensional diagrams. Have you had to deal with sort of these more complex layouts where you're actually having to take multiple types of production?
Oh, sure, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the question was, what are the challenges of dealing with, you know, yeah,
Like a really cool house SML XL is sort of in one direction. You
right,
blow up everything really large and fetishize it.
right.
You know, that would not make sense, but like how would you deal with like a variety of
Well, I think I mean if you're dealing with a variety of media, and what you have are everything that could be, and in fact, it wasn't just the Sterling book is only. I don't think there's any finished work shown in that. I think it's all drawings, models, sketches, stuff like that. But like like that Johnson book, say if you picture that Lincoln Center spread, that shows like the glossy photograph is on the right-hand side, and then progressive sketches, what look like presentation sketches or working drawings or elevations of the New York State Theater are shown on the left of that page. And I think basically there's a couple of challenges with that. One is that glossy photographs tend to sort of be like they're like bombs. People, the more real it looks, the more people are likely to attend to them. So a lot of times when you're staging these things, you have to do this sort of, there's this sort of like lifespan that a project has, right, where it begins as a sketch and then progresses along, and then the climax is meant to be this glossy photograph, I guess, right? So one of the tactics you have is to kind of exploit the basic narrative of that and people's actual interest in sort of seeing the genesis of things. People really are interested in sort of seeing, oh, that was the original sketch, to the degree that I know at least several famous architects who will go back and retrofit that original sketch if it didn't already exist, just because it's so interesting to see the original sketch, So, so I think a lot of times just that sense of, here it was on the day of its birth, here it is, when it was fully grown, is of interest to people. But what it requires, I think, is you modulate that. You have to kind of balance that interest against people's natural tendency to sort of discount, the stages in between in favor of the big splashy ending, right? Which, if it is indeed that color photograph of the built thing, in your case, it's likely to be it could be a well-photographed model. It could be a rendering that you've invested a lot of time in. And these days, rendering skills have gotten so good that in some cases, the renderings are, as you know, indistinguishable from the final built thing. So I think that's one way of dealing with it. Another way, I think, I usually tell people, this is true for the editors and the subjects of the books I've dealt with, and it's also true for students. It's really judicious and careful editing tends to be your friend as well. I think one's tendency is, if you've really done a lot of work on something, it's very tempting to show all that work. You did it, I want to show it, right? And it's really easy to lose sight of when diminishing returns set in. I mean, sometimes sort of, if you've really done, 100 variations of something, those 100 variations in a grid might be fascinating in and of themselves, right? But sort of like these minute changes, unless, it's sometimes people just get weary, and it's actually just picking out the key ones that actually show, real moments of developmental change in a project is more important. That will, in at least a printed book, you have limited real estate. So the fewer things you show, the more they can be big. And then particularly when it comes to drawings and sketches and stuff like that, the challenge is that they just tend to be sometimes faint, sometimes hard, much harder to see, and sometimes harder for people to decipher than stuff that's more robust. So I think it's storytelling and editing are the two key words there. Yeah.
Tell me if this sounds sort of stupid, but what's up with dust jackets? And why, dust jackets?
Yeah.
Why do some books have them and some books don't? And is there a history behind?
Oh yeah, you want to know?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's a history behind dust jackets, absolutely. The history of dust jackets, I promise this will be short, I promise, is that really rich people who were amassing libraries, and who were presumably true, they might have been just the dopey predecessors to today's McMansion owners. But when a learned person was putting together a library, one of the things they would do as a matter of course was they would get all the books rebound in their own particular style, so you would know it was from their library. So covers then meant nothing at all. You would sort of buy a book with an inexpensive paper cover, take it off, and then get it rebound in a dust jacket more suited to your own personal taste. Or not a dust jacket, a hard cover, a cloth cover, more suited to your taste. That's why particularly if you're like traveling in Europe, you go in a good bookstore, you'll see those, piles of kind of like really kind of literary books from Italy, let's say. They'll have the most boring covers in the world, just a color and a little bit of type. Really beautiful in a way, but so different from what European publishers would call the American way, which is like big author names, big vivid photographs, right, to make you buy the books, right? And so, but when, that sort of evolved into, well, people couldn't actually get their books, bound themselves, so they'd come in a nice cloth cover. And so the publishers would put the books in a nice cloth cover, which is the thing you see under the dust jacket. But then the marketing people would say, this book's got to sell, so we have to do something a bit more dramatic that'll sell it. So that's when the dust jacket came in. So actually, dust jackets are meant to be the wrapper around the actual book. And in fact, I think as originally conceived, the idea would be that you'd buy the book, you buy the book because of the dust jacket, let's say, but then you'd throw the dust jacket off to consume the book, just as you throw the boxes, you eat the cereal and you throw out the box it came in. You don't kind of treasure that and put that on a shelf and think, yeah, Life cereal, 2004, excellent. So I think you were meant to throw those dust jackets out. Then somewhere along the way in the 20th century, different graphic artists started getting involved with dust jacket design, and it got progressively more refined. And so now I think people just assume the dust jackets will be retained on the books. Now, however, with the book as object as an idea, some books have dust jackets still, and in fact, there's sort of a signal now of this is like a more normal book that you would like buy and like read. You'd sit and you'd like read it on the subway, or you'd read it on the beach, or you'd read it like a normal book. And then books that sort of have like more kooky covers, which could be what you call wrapped cover, which I think like the Libeskind book is a wrap cover. There's no dust jacket on that. That silver thing actually was wrapped around the board that you'd otherwise wrap a fake cloth cover around these days. And so a lot of those books, some of them were wrap covers, some of them were dust jackets. The difference usually it has a little bit to do with conventionality versus progressiveness, or kind of book as object versus book as meant to be read sort of thing. So it's used as this fairly subtle signal. And in fact, publishers are really interesting to work with, because so many books, a book is a consumer product when it gets in a bookstore. You really are buying it like you're buying cereal. We'll see what happens now that people can buy books online, where presumably the tools of consumer marketing, like packaging, like big pictures, like author names, are all sort of being leveled as you're just sort of sorting through something on your iPad or buying things on Amazon or whatever. But at a shelf in a Barnes and Noble, you're being marketed to just as you would if you were buying razor blades or cereal or potato chips or anything else. The same techniques are being used, although book jacket designers are a refined breed of designer who move in their own special circles and enjoy their own special celebrity due to their contact they have with famous authors, sometimes which is actually true and not exaggerated as it is other times. And they get to keep all those books too, which is great, for free, because they're paid so little often. So like if you go in a store now, you can like all those. The same design team has designed all of Jonathan Foer's books to have that kind of handwritten thing. The same, really kind of, and even like, Vladimir Nabokov, who was like really picky about the design of his book jackets, kind of eventually kind of forced his publisher, who I think was Harper and Row, I think, to kind of like design all the covers the same way. Partly because he had seen seen more than one paperback edition of, you guessed it, Lolita, that had all sorts of unsavory, sensationalistic things on it that just really seemed repugnant to him. So he was like really determined to have all those books the same. And in fact, the original first editions of every one of those books, from Lolita to Pale Fire to Speak Memory, all look exactly the same. They have that Vladimir Nabokov brand, and it's just as relentless as IBM or Apple or anything else would envy today, I would say. So does that answer, that over answers your question? Are you sorry you asked?
No,
Thank you. Good. Anything else? Good, it's a beautiful day. Thank you so much for sitting in this windowless auditorium with one of my books. If any of you want to see these things in real life, I have a couple copies up here.
And also your type book.
And then you can each have one too. Oh, and